Okay. Okay. So yeah. So um, I just thought that this was a really good lecture for the equinox time period, right? Which is sort of this, play on the equal night and day of this moving into the fall season, and how the medicine wheel is kind of like this understanding of the Tao, right? And the flow from one to another, and that they all have their purpose and their season. And so it's all kind of part of this unitive experience. And then how we separate out and kind of take it into a dualistic approach. So this is a good lecture, and I think this is a good time of the year to explore it. So um, and for those of you that are joining me or considering joining me for the little process group for Tuesday night, that's basically looking at this path from, the approach of kind of awakening our awareness of the higher self, and embedding and embodying and getting more conscious of the higher self, as a way of also, having, facing more fully our lower self, our other aspects, but it helps a lot when we can feel the truth of who we are and the connection to this larger self. And so kind of part of my exploration in this group is like how to look at the higher self a little more and deepen our connection and understanding with that. And so I think this lecture feeds into that well. Um, okay, welcome, Dominique. She's connecting in too. Um, give her a minute more and then we can begin. So we also often, just open up, like if anybody has, read the lecture, if they have anything that they want, that kind of struck them or, spoke to them in the beginning that they want to, highlight or share. So it's open and people are welcome to, share anything, also any way to just get here and arrive. So anybody want to speak to the moment?
Yeah, I'd like to chime in. I've listened to this lecture numerous times, and what strikes me often is how difficult it is to stay in the non-dual state when you're feeling defensive or when you're feeling like, well, I guess feeling defensive is the non-dual state, right? But I just find it once some kind of part of me is activated and I'm worried that I'm going to miss out on something. I guess that's the cyclical nature of it, is that the fear makes it even thicker of a framework to think that, it's either or, and I can only have this or only that. And so that the mind kind of narrows. But it's so tough if you're feeling attacked or accused or something else, when that fight or flight starts kicking in. I find myself remembering that there is such a thing as a non-dual state, but to actually enter into it is a whole different story.
In that moment, right? No, exactly. Yeah. That is the work, I think, in a way. And not to be discouraged, because it is difficult. Our whole fight flight kind of system is geared into that, our animal nature, our lower self, which is not just negativity, right? But like the first three chakras, right? Which the root chakra is survival needs, and it's the pleasure and the need for substance and life force in the second chakra, and the needs for being recognized and seen as an individual kind of in that third chakra. So all of these are part of what seems to get threatened right? In these moments, and particularly usually where we're getting reactivated is where there is old trauma. So I see it as trauma trance. I see it as, the old uh, understanding of having a spell cast on us, right? We're sort of bespelled and we need to dispel the spell and wake up, out of this illusion, out of this realm of threat, right? That we are actively believing so completely in that moment. And so it's, don't be discouraged in a way that we can't just get it like that, or we can't shift it even in the midst of it when we see it. Because if we humbly and honestly just accept it and look at it, and realize, oh, here I am again, and just keep working it, right? Because each time we go into it, it's another opportunity. And we may not be able to, right in that moment, access the, deeper pain that it's defending against, right? It is this defense. But we can often use it in a session or later on, because it stays active in us to some degree. And it's always like using those opportunities once we do wake up and realize, oh, I'm back in that pain body state, I'm being possessed by this particular story that lives in me, right? And if you can see it that way, it's also really useful, I think, that we actually get possessed by certain stories, right, that are the conscious understanding that we have of these situations. And oftentimes, they go into the body and they're not always obviously conscious, but usually when we can be in the experience of it, we can begin to recognize, oh, that's what this part of me believes. That's what the, defense is defending against. That's what, so we want to deeply understand, all of these parts. And so each time we lose ourselves in them is just another opportunity, and also to forgive ourselves, to learn how to make a different choice inside and clear it. Um, and so, we, here comes somebody else coming in. Don't know if that, is sufficient or helps. We'll get into this a little bit more, I think, in the lecture as well. But, there is this, real way, Jacob, that what you're speaking, I think, is, a real important piece of the work. And, to have the humility to just kind of keep waking up inside of that trauma trance, inside of that space of possession, and repossess ourselves and work with that suffering being, work with that trauma, work with that within ourselves. So, okay, that's enough. Welcome, Indra and everybody else. I think we have a full crew today. So let me go ahead. Anybody else have any kind of statement or opening here that we need to include? So this is Pathwork Lecture 143, and it's called Unity and Duality. And again, for everybody that's new, just I'm going to read through it a little bit, comment, and anybody's welcome to break in, question. I try to pause every so often, but also just jump in if you have a question or want to make a comment. So its opening says, greetings, my dearest friends. May this evening be a blessing and an enrichment for every one of you here, for all who read these words. May you open your minds and your hearts so you can deeply understand yourselves. And if you can not understand immediately, some of these words may take root in your psyche and come to fruition later. Full understanding of this lecture may reach you only as you work your way through the deep layers of your unconscious, where what I say here will apply. So, again, we always are getting different layers, excavating deeper and deeper in this. So he says there are two basic ways to approach life and the self. Or to put it differently, there are two fundamental possibilities for human consciousness, the dualistic and the unified plane. The majority of human beings live predominantly on the dualistic plane, where you perceive and experience everything in opposites, either or, good or bad, right or wrong, life or death. In other words, practically everything you encounter, every human problem, is shaped by this dualism. So see if you can kind of take a minute and think of a human problem that you might have, and see if that could be applied here. It's like, does it seem like it's based on your assessment that something is okay or not okay, something is good or bad, right or wrong, life or death? And he says the unified principle, in a way, combines the opposites of the dualism. And by transcending dualism, it will also transcend the pain it causes. So he's kind of pointing to the fact that most of our suffering comes from the split inside of us that is created by the dualistic approach. And then, we are torn and unclear and lost in, one side saying how we should be, one other side being how it is, right? And all of this gets tangled up together, and we get lost in the maze in a way. So by few human beings actually transcend the dualistic plane, and most people experience only an occasional taste of the limitless outlook, the wisdom and the freedom of the unified plane. But I think that part of the new age and part of where we're going right now is really calling for us to work with this more, and is really more close than we imagine in some ways. And by sort of working with it also, I think we awaken that inner center of our being that already, holds that truth and that wisdom. So he says, on the unified plane, I keep wanting to qualify on this, like, because there is this gendered, issue a little bit in terms of how Eva basically, I think, referred to the guide as he. That's what I've always heard. And yet the guide himself said that there were many beings that, were involved in creating the lectures. So, in some ways, it's really the guide they, um, in all of this. So forgive me if I'm, just coming out of the masculine pronoun there. I think it's just a big habit. So I'll try to remember. But just to say also for people to, understand, in the spirit world, the guide often says, that things, are translated through our lens so we can understand a little bit, but it's not really how reality is. So on the unified plane of consciousness, there are no opposites. There is no good or bad, no right or wrong, no life or death. There's only good, only right, only life. Yet it is not the kind of good or right or life that comprises only one pole of the dualistic opposite. It transcends them both and is completely different from either one. The good, the right, the life that exists on the unified plane of consciousness combine both dualistic poles, so no conflict exists. This is why living in a unified state in absolute reality creates bliss, unlimited freedom, fulfillment, and that unlimited realization of potentials, which religion calls heaven. Heaven is usually thought to be a place in time and space. This, of course, is not so. Heaven is a state of consciousness that can be realized at any time by any entity, whether a human being in the flesh or one who does not live in a material body. So, this is an interesting lecture for me as well, because one of the things, and coming back from my month-long journey out west and, sort of being untethered from, my usual responsibilities and plans and, aspects of running the business, it's kind of like, it was an opportunity to open and surrender in a way, and I did it intentionally and kind of asked and prayed for it. But it was very clear to me that during the trips I was kind of really held in a unitive state, and I didn't have a lot of plans or deadlines or anything like that. So whatever was arising, I was just assuming was, a part of this journey for whatever, and was part of the mystery of this journey and part of what I would encounter on the way. And assuming that whatever it was, even though it might be problematic or a little challenging, that, I was supported and there was, ways of moving through it and finding the course and continuing on. And it was surprising to me, like how well that worked, and how I was not reacting to all of the little things that would often, cause me to be frustrated or, fearful or something like that. Even when I had car troubles, it was kind of like this real deep place of surrender that now that I'm coming back and, like back into my regular life, I'm kind of realizing, oh, and the temptation is a lot more now. And I'm trying to hold that space a little more and continue to use it as reference. Oh, that was unitive consciousness, right? And to keep recognizing and letting go, getting out of the way of sort of the unfoldment of the divine world, in its sense. And all we can do is meet it and try to trust it, and be open to guidance, to like in the very first lecture, the guide talks about navigating the sea of life, right? And so when we are, grounded and in touch and, understanding, then we can really navigate that vessel across the seas and grow and learn and find a way that is, more heaven than hell, right? Where we are in touch with, the duality of life. It can never always be summer, right? Or it can never always be just one way. It's always transforming, it's always changing, it's always moving. So this, ability to accept and surrender to that kind of process and allow that movement to happen, kind of riding it as a natural wave that, in the universe, I think mostly, it does seem to want to go to a higher order, to a, another space, but there is no way to stop the changes. And that's a part of what the guide is saying, is how the duality starts with life and death, right? And how, we want to go forward in the field of time to arrive at some kind of achievement or state where we want to get to. And yet we also understand that, the further forward we go, the less time we have, right? The closer we are coming to our own death. So there's many, deep teachings in this medicine wheel of life. In this, I often think in unity and duality of the symbol for yin and yang, right? Where and it's kind of most represented in nature and in the Tao, where you have, there's night and there's day, and there's summer and there's winter, and there's hot and there's cold, and they move, and there's, they're within each other. There's the little light and the darkness and the dark and the light, and it's always moving. And in that there's balance, in that there's flow, in that, there's a kind of way of being with and receiving life fully, and whatever we were meant in a way to go through and experience. So I don't know, how does that land in people? Does that make sense? No comments? So yeah, I mean, it's really an interesting practice if you've ever been on a vision quest or a, like a journey like I went on to kind of explore that state, right? So and then to, like Jacob was saying in the beginning, work with those things that trigger trigger us, where we know we're in this, huge life or death emotional battle with a situation that, like is based on how we're interpreting it and how we're experiencing it. We can't let go, right? And that's a very powerful place to try to wake up and just be conscious in and try to understand. So again, the guide right here is saying, that the unified state of consciousness is attained through understanding or knowingness, right? So, as we kind of wake up inside of our trauma trance a little bit, it's like we can see more clearly, especially if we don't again go into duality of judging ourselves, of making, right or wrong, however we're reacting. But be curious, what is this reaction saying? This reaction is so big, it you know it must be, defending against something very fearful or fearsome in some way to the being. And so, to understand and to try to be a space of compassion and willingness to go into this darkness, with these tender places, is kind of like what our own consciousness can do. We can befriend all of these traumatized parts and work with them as they, are trying to go through and out the other side, facing those feelings that, they think will be the death of them. And, oftentimes the guide is saying, that's the only way that we can have life, right, is to die to our fears. Otherwise, we're always constricting and trying to control. And that takes us out of this true, immediate soul experience that we're trying to go for as much as we can. So any
Darlene,
questions? Yeah.
yeah, I think my hang up, or I can see where my hang up would be if um, I didn't see it a little bit more broadly, but I can see a part of me being triggered around the unified state as being more like feminine and more passive in some way, where if there is some kind of struggle between states of mind, between options and choices, because we do live in a dualistic sphere, right? So there is hot and there is cold, right? And there's also warm, but I guess sometimes it appears to be only one way or another way. But sometimes there literally is only one way. Either I go outside or I stay inside, right? And so if I have some kind of tug of war, sometimes the unified state may, I guess, wrongly be perceived as the passive feminine, and where you submit, and so there
Right.
isn't as much of the active force in it. And so I think that could be a triggering
Yeah, it's part of a
around.
misconception. And it's one that's not uncommon, right? Because it's a third state that we don't get very well. So we know rebellion and submission, but we don't understand really surrender. And surrender is a very active state when we truly grasp, what it is. Um, and in a way, it's a temporary thing as well. In my understanding, like, it's like as long as we're reacting to the situation, now we're actually recreating the trauma drama stuff. And if we can like recognize, oh, here this reality is, let me not react, let me just really be present to it, right? It doesn't mean be submissive to it. It means, relax, pay attention, and when the moment comes for you to make your aikido move that will transform it, or help you, recognize that, it's not that important to you or whatever, there's different, resolutions, but that resolution comes out of this sort of larger unitive understanding, right? Where you see right and wrong on both sides, where you see, the truth of what really is maybe trying to happen in that moment, which might be totally different than in another moment. The mind is always way overgeneralizing everything. And so it keeps calling us into this present now to allow the truth of the Holy Spirit to inform us. And, like, if there's action that is required, the action comes from the heart and not from the defense, right? So what we're trying to do is disarm the defense long enough for the larger capacity of the heart to take effect. So does that help? I mean, what you're
Yeah,
saying
for
is
sure. For
useful for
sure.
everybody, I'm sure. And so people just have to work with this, and where you feel like that's where you're, where the stuckness is, oh, if I go there, I have to surrender. Then you can examine that a little more closely, right? It's again part of the study. Okay, in what way? What does that mean? How do you see that, right? And then the guide is saying in this lecture and in other places, the key is then to ask, okay, so that's how I perceive it. Now, what is the truth? Because if I'm in duality, if I'm in conflict, that means I'm not in truth, period, the end. So, truth is this on this unitive level, ultimate truth. And so where we are still split, we can automatically assume that, we're not, in the total possibility. And it's okay, we can stay in those positions, but he's saying that it's kind of shadow boxing in a way. And these are deep, places in the unconscious that then impress and respond to our defense, and then the recreation happens and stuff like that. So in order to kind of calm the waters, right, all of the reaction and like affects the energetic spaces and affects the ocean that we're living in. And it's every time we're in reaction, it just adds to the confusion and turmoil in a way. So as we just stay present and work to calm and be with, and not in a sense of, just laying down and allowing, but, seeking to, feel it, understand it more deeply, and maybe go in and hold in our own self the place that feels so reactive, right? And to look at, like, that's we think it's coming from the other person in this moment. This lecture kind of goes into that dynamic, right, about the right and wrong in the relationship. But it's never really about that. It's always about an old trauma, and it's getting, brought back up. And so if we can recognize, oh, this is not about the present, this is about an old battle that maybe even was in a past life, but it came in, and it's kind of an old dynamic that, like you're saying, for me, says, I can't surrender that. I can't let go. I can't stop fighting, because that would be submitting. And if I submitted, what would I have to feel, right? What's the death? um, and that may have been a death that you suffered from in earlier years. It may have been something that was traumatizing in some way. So you're totally wired to like run and fight whenever you run up against that dualism. But it's like when we can wake up and not run or fight in the moment, breathe, be with it, notice what's happening, and then sometimes we do, and we just have to wake up whenever we do and still work with it, right? But there's this deeper knowingness that we can come into as we work with this old trauma that's using these present circumstances to reveal itself, to come into the light of consciousness. And if we can remember that that's what's going on, instead of, oh, I'm in a pitched battle with my boss or my mate or whatever, then it helps. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there might not be some real need in that, in those differences or whatever. But if you can resolve it at this level first, that tends to make a huge difference. So, so he says, let's understand the particular struggle and therefore the human predicament a little better. Oh, I think I skipped a little bit. So the unified state of consciousness is attained through understanding or knowingness. Life on the dualistic plane is a continuous problem. You have to struggle with the arbitrary, illusory division of the unified principle through which things become opposites that impose conflicts. This creation of irreconcilable opposites generates a tension within and therefore with the outside world. So let's understand this particular struggle. You already have in your real self a unified state of mind, regardless of how unconscious and ignorant you may be of it. This real self embodies the unified principle. So it's already in us, right? And even those who have never heard of such a thing, we have a deep longing and it's a mostly unconscious sense of a different state of mind and life experience than this one that we know that's always this battle. And there's a yearning for this freedom, this mastery of life, that we recognize, is like a potential, coming to us through this unified state. And then we try to attain it on the dualistic state. So he says this longing is misinterpreted by the personality partly because it is an unconscious yearning for happiness and fulfillment. But let's understand precisely what we really mean by these words. They mean the unification of the dualistic opposites. So there is no longer any tension, conflict, or fear. Consequently, the world comes alive and the self is mastered, not in a tight, tense, hostile way. We don't have to control things, right? And if you really pay attention to how much energy you put in controlling things, and see, like how that burns up the life force fuel that, you have in this one lifetime. So we're, squandering, like trying to use our energy in this way to control things. And in the sense that life can be exactly how we determine it to be. So there's a real freedom and mastery and bliss that, we can attain, but it's not through the ego control and the outer process of controlling. So, but we still long for this liberation and we seek after it unconsciously, in this way of trying to, get the world to comply with how we want it to be. And we, want to avoid the pain of disappointment or unfulfillment or all of that. And so we, we split the world into two places where, half of it we're running after and the other half we're running from, right? And the happiness, like if you really see how pervasive, it's like happiness can't come in any way from that equation. So when freedom, mastery, unification, and the resulting bliss of the unified state of consciousness are pursued on the dualistic plane, a tremendous conflict must ensue because they are absolutely impossible to accomplish on that plane. You strive for the fulfillment of your deep longing to transcend and find deep within yourself a new state of consciousness where all is one. And when you seek this on the plane where all is divided, you cannot ever find what you seek. You will despair and split yourself farther apart in conflicts, for illusion creates duality. So when the vague longing for or the precise theoretical knowledge of the unified plane of consciousness is misread and therefore sought on the dualistic plane, here's what happens. You sense that there is only good, freedom, right, beauty, love, truth, and life without a threatening opposite. But when you apply this on the dualistic plane, you will immediately be plunged into the very conflict you seek to avoid. For when you fight for one of the dualistic aspects against the other, it's like they manifest each other, and such a fight makes transcendence impossible. So then he uses this demonstration or example of a familiar everyday human problem so that we can make it a little more clear and concrete. So he says, let's assume that you are quarreling with a friend and you are convinced from where you sit that you are right, and therefore immediately the friend must be wrong becomes wrong, right? And your feelings and your understanding. And when dualistic understanding, issues can only be an either or. So the outcome seems to matter then more than the issue itself. For when the intensity of motion is truly tested, it often has no relationship to the issue at stake, right? So you probably recognize sometimes, that what you're arguing about is not as important as somehow the feeling that comes up in you and the fight that ensues around it. So it would rather be commensurate with a life or death issue. So oftentimes, it's really good to feel that, because that's your immediate clue that you're in an image, right? You're reacting to what the Pathwork guide calls an image, which is an illusion, right? A story about what's happening that's not, in reality. And so we're in a battle, creating out of illusion, creating more illusion. Okay, welcome. So yeah, if everybody can mute themselves unless they're speaking, that probably would be good. I don't know if we're bouncing people in and out or people having trouble staying on. How's everybody doing? Anybody want to speak here? So
Yeah, when talking about that transistence impossible with the duality,
say again.
when you're talking about the transistence, it becomes impossible. It's right there on the
Right, the transcendence becomes impossible from the
transcendence.
dualistic
Yeah.
place. Right.
Uh-huh. That's with duality. Well, of course, it's with duality, but so you're just kind of saying that we're kind of trying to balance ourselves in a way, or
Well, it's more than that. There's a way that we, judge the world and everything that's happening in it, and including ourselves, right? And everything that's arising. And we kind of, the ego mind sort of almost immediately reacts, right? Good, bad, right, wrong, okay, not okay, right? And there's tension, and there's kind of on guard vigilance, and it's trying to control the world so that it can make sure that the good is what's happening and not the bad, and all of that. But it's like there's a lot of effort and a lot of illusion in that process, and it never works, because the more that we are trying to defend against it, the more it actually manifests what we're running from. So the
that makes a
transcendent,
lot of sense. That makes a
yeah,
lot of
okay, yeah, good. So this transcendent place, right, is kind of like where the guy talks about, like, from one state of consciousness, like we only want the good and the perfect, and that we want it our way, and if it's a little bit different than how we want it, then everything is terrible, right? And so we have this kind of uh, either or state that only wants the positive. And he says from there we want to move into a state that accepts, like, life has both, and it has life and death. It has challenges and deep journeys that we take with people that we love, and all kinds of different things that we get into in this experience, and that's all good in some way. And we come to understand that as we expand and are able to be with what is happening, and trust and discover sort of the actual blessing maybe that's or the silver lining in the cloud or whatever that is there. So, but yeah, it's a journey, and we start in various states of dualism and then are looking to, especially where we find ourselves in reaction, to kind of free ourselves and to unravel that dualistic consciousness and set ourselves free. So he's talking here
Yes.
then. Any more? Was that helpful? What else do you want to say?
Uh, very, very well explained. Thank you.
Okay. So, and he gets, I think, and I think this is really helpful to see, right? So we're in an argument with somebody, and in some ways, we're reacting as if it's a life and death issue, because on the unconscious level, he says, feeling like we're wrong means somehow death. It means being denied by the other. It means, like that we're not seen, that. So there's some kind of unconscious death that we face when we're in an argument, and we feel like we're fighting to be right. It's like fighting for survival, right? Fighting for the other person to see the truth that we hold, that will set us free, that will make everything right, but it doesn't. That's the crazy thing, is we're so intent on trying to make it happen through this process of winning, of getting them to see our side, of insisting that we're right and they're wrong, and that is what creates like the impasse. Because for us to be right, we got to make the other guy wrong, and they're not any more interested in being wrong than we are. It's like it puts them in the same double bind, right? And we can't accept them to submit or accept this double bind any more than we will, right? Does that make sense? So somehow we have to, like really recognize, where we fear, like if we're, what will happen if they don't see us, or if they don't really understand what is our fear. And then, is that the truth? Is that fear realistic? Is that an old fear from the past that we're defending against? Is that like a way that in our defense we actually recreate what we're expecting somehow? So there's all of this way that we begin to unravel and see past this right wrong duality and split. But it's difficult because it really does feel like a death when we can't get the other person to see. And so he kind of does a little digression here and brings us back to this argument a little bit later. So let's go ahead and continue. So he says, on the dualistic plane, our sense of identity is associated with the other person and not with the real self. So as long as we experience ourself only as the outer ego, there's a kind of dependency on others to get them to agree with us, to see us, to approve of us, all of that, right? And that sort of dependency means that we have to control them in order to, feel safe again. So when you have realized the center of your being, which embodies unification, does your life cease to depend on others only when you have realized, okay, the center of your own being. And so this is a part of, what I feel is like the whole point also of connecting with our higher self, right? Is in a way, as long as we're dependent on the outer, support, and we're not drawing it from within our inner wisdom, from the larger universal self sphere, right? Then we're kind of trapped in this part of the duality. So it's part of what he's saying, and part of what I think is my sense of like as we go and really connect with this true self within us and awaken that to show up for all of the other parts of us, right? Then we don't need everybody else to see us because we're seeing ourselves, and we can take, a painful struggle or confusion and really work it through and find the truth. So we sort of become our own internal helper, and help, unravel a lot of the places. And our lives are going to be a series. It's not like we get beyond duality, right? I think there's this great value in, encountering it, right, and resolving it, encountering it and resolving it. And I think that's kind of the stage that we're at now, is like re-looking at the whole world, you know, uh, and trying to recognize, oh, I'm in my duality vision, right? What does unity look like from here, right? How can I, what would be different if I could see it through the unitive state? So, these kind of practices can help us realize what's possible as well, because we're so locked into this other way.
Darlene, do you feel that truth is the path to unification? I mean, isn't it kind of so that we are constantly struggling to discern truth from distortion? And if we knew the truth about all of these incidences and consequences, we might be more in a unified, or more easily find a unified state. But we're constantly trying to discern the truth from distortion in this world.
Exactly.
It's sort of the soul at work, actually,
Yeah, exactly. And it's not always easy, but this is the other reason why I think, like to recognize the higher self, right? Like there's clues, like, okay, if you feel like, it's a life or death issue, maybe that's that your belief is pointing out an image and not ultimate truth. If you're in a dualistic space, right, like you can at least know, even though you may not quite fully understand how to unify your own particular dualism, you can recognize, oh, I'm in duality. That means I'm in illusion at some level. I'm not going to, back this with with everything totally. I'm going to question it. I'm going to keep, seeking to understand the larger reality that's here for me, instead of just reacting in the old dynamic. And that's kind of what we came here to do, right? I really believe we brought in these pain bodies, these old wounded places, these old trauma, trance places, because our higher self really is who we are. And that is the light that can transform all of these other traumatized places. And so it's seeking and reaching up to this higher potential of truth, and sometimes it really is difficult to discern it, but other times, it helps just to understand the spiritual laws, the basic principles, right, and see where we're in deviation from those. And that can often, help clarify or bring, and we can seek, we can ask the higher self, like, I don't get it, what's the truth? And oftentimes in meditation, revelation comes, we see something more fully. So absolutely, I would say that the truth is the key, and it is the work that we're doing to determine. So on the dualistic plane, each issue ends with either life or death. And life becomes terribly important in order to avoid death, right? So it's more important as life to avoid death than to like live life, right? And so people fear death so much that they run into it head on. And such individuals do not escape fear of death. Quite the contrary, their constant struggle with life, which results from their fear and struggle against death, renders them unhappy, and they believe that they don't fear death. And this is an illusion as long as life is experienced on the dualistic plane. And so he talks a little bit about, like these confusions around life and death. And he says, as long as, again, we feel that we must win, right? This is, it's amazing if you're honest with yourself, you'll feel, how life or death winning can be. Because your side is true while the other's is false. He says you're deeply involved in the world of duality and therefore in illusion, conflict, and confusion. So, if we can't understand or acknowledge anything else, at least we can humble and, kind of go there. And we may still have a lot of energy charge in the defense, right? So I'm not saying, that you'll disarm completely and totally, but just even the more that we can bring this total picture to, what we're working with, and not try to control or rule out the unruly parts that are, in defense or, feeling all of their feelings, but to become the space, for us to witness, to try to understand, to seek deeper clarity and illuminate these parts and their traumas, right? And help them feel what they couldn't feel in the original situation because nobody was there to hold them, right? And that's where the trauma comes from. And so, like, as we come to, face this deep, loss that we felt as children, and feel that again, maybe through a fight where we feel like we're not seen or we're not heard, and we can drop into that true feeling, right, of the pain of that, and at the same time hold ourselves and see ourselves and recognize, what's going on. Then it's like it can be processed within us, and the energy is released and clarified, is my experience with it. So every truth can be divided into two opposites, one being adhered to as the right and the opposite being declared the wrong idea. In reality, however, the two complement one another. So that's a key, like, when you're in a, either or dynamic, see if you can see, well, how are they complementary in some way? And on the unified plane, there really neither aspect is thinkable without the other. So therefore, the complements are not enemies or negations of each other, except on the dualistic plane of consciousness are they so opposed. And, and then he goes on and he talks about also, like, where there's, the truth, there's distortion and divinity on both sides. So if we're asking and seeking what is the truth, like we tend to think, oh, I should side with this side versus that side, particular duality. But he's pointing to the fact that no, every duality has divinity and distortion on both sides. So he goes back to the example. He says, the more you prove your friend wrong, the more friction exists, and the less you obtain what you thought you would by proving yourself right and your friend wrong. You thought you would get approval or, a concordance or connection, in some way, right? It's what we're seeking, like if we're right, then they can, and yet that never happens, because when we're proving our friend wrong, right, it doesn't work that way. So you believe that by proving yourself right and your friend wrong, your friend will finally accept and love you again, and all will be well, right? I mean, can you feel that in the unconscious child aspects of what you're doing in the argument? And that's good to see. It's good to see, and compassion and understanding that, like that the child is just frantically trying to get connected, right? So we have to make it wrong, but we have to see that what's going on is not working very well. And so, as it's frantically trying to connect, it's actually, forcing the other person further away. and the rift widens and the anxiety increases. And then the more weapons you use to win the fight, and the deeper then you dig your hole, right? Until you actually damage yourself or the other and act against your own best interests. So does people recognize this?
I would say though that proving your friend wrong, proving yourself right, I would say you have to also get your friend to agree with you. Otherwise, you're, deep inside, you're always going to know that things are never going to be right.
Well, and what the guide is saying is there's no way that you're ever going to get your friend to agree with you.
Right.
Because, in order to make yourself right and your friend, you have to make your friend wrong, and the friend is not going to voluntarily accept that he's wrong, right? It's like, especially when there's usually right and wrong on both sides, right? So the friend has got their own, perspective and their own side. And, so it's like the whole issue of making anybody wrong, whether it's yourself or somebody else, is what's the problem here, right? And this whole category of duality that says there's anything that's either right or wrong completely, and like everything is right and wrong. Everything is, happening through the kind of unfoldment that of the motion that we've set in action and all of that. So, and when we can usually feel into it, we can feel, and oftentimes on the other side we can look back and realize, oh, that was the most terrible thing I ever went through, but it was the biggest and most brilliant and most important thing that ever happened in my life, because it's what helped me see something or taught me something, or and if I had to do it over, I would go through it again, even though it was really hard, right? So we have to kind of begin to see the world outside of these categories is part of the suggestion here, right? And whenever we're trapped inside of those categories and we're in a split around it, in a battle line, or instead of being complements, instead of being a dance of the Tao, instead of being the movement of, transition and change, and, one thing has its time and place, and then another thing, we start, opposing, or, trying to force something. And then that causes everything to get out of place, because the ego is now trying to control the life force and the movement of life, when it's really the higher self that needs to be trusted. And it's the the whole journey that the soul is taking that is teaching us. And so oftentimes the ego is learning how to let go, more and more, how to trust everything that's going on, including the things that it would think is wrong or doesn't want, is painful or whatever. So, and especially here, in these fights in relationship, and I know, I see it so often, in couples and in other situations, where it is hard, because you want to be seen, you want to be understood, and everything. But where you notice that what happens is, things get into this conflict, then it's good to go inside and look a little deeper and do some inner process about that, because it's usually pointing to a good healing, right? And you might miss that if you just approach it at the level of the present day, relationship. So he says, when you are then faced with further conflict which arises out of the first dualistic split, in order to avoid a total rift with all its real and imagined threats, for real damage has begun to be wrought, you are now faced with the alternatives of having to give in order to appease your friend and avoid further damage to yourself, or to continue fighting. And since you're still convinced that there is a right versus a wrong, such appeasement robs you of self-respect and you fight against that. Whether you use this solution or not, you will be torn between fighting or submitting. So there's only two of those, and those are dualistic, and none of them are the answer. That's the duality that the unitive state transcends, and it's this whole process of, the surrender that opens to the moment and then responds from the wisdom of the unitive self. So
If we take away the friend, pretty much have this battle with ourselves.
exactly, all the time.
I mean, otherwise we'd be in a unitive state when the friend was gone.
And that really, we're, the split is inside of us. And until we actually do start befriending ourselves and really learning how to be in a unitive, relationship with our own, parts, we can't really fully love and be in a unitive state, in the outer level either. And usually what we discover when we do the work around the, the trauma drama that's getting enacted in a dualistic split that's, manifested outside in the world, is that it's really a projection of two conflicting parts inside of us. And if we really knew which one we kind of landed in, or where we were grounding and where the unified truth was, we could just stand in that and we wouldn't be in the conflict. It would resolve the conflict. So it's always saying that, what we think is right. It's only half truth. We have to keep looking deeper. And so yeah, he's talking about then the second duality develops then, out of the first, who is right and who is wrong. And only I can be right, otherwise everything is bad. And the second is either giving in to a wrong that you cannot admit, for it is a total wrong, or continuing the fight. And admitting a wrong means death in a sense. So you're faced with the alternatives of admitting a wrong, which means death in the deep psyche, in order to avoid the dreaded consequence and possibility of a real risk, like losing the friendship or hurting somebody that you don't want to hurt, putting your life at a grave disadvantage against death in the deepest sense, or insisting on your total rightness. So anyway you turn, you find death, loss, and annihilation. And so that's also like a really good key to realize when you're in image land, when you're in duality, when you're in illusion, is when it feels like no matter what you do, there's a death, right? It's like there's a long, slow death or a short, quick death. But no matter which one of those dualities that you try to, go into, it ends up, death. So immediately from there that you're lost in illusion, you're lost in duality, and you need to penetrate much more deeply and seek, to understand what these deeper unitive truths are and how they come together and where this is coming from inside of yourself and, what it's trying to resolve. So any way you turn, you find death, loss, and annihilation. And the harder you fight for and against, the less there is to fight for, and the more alternatives turn against you. The illusion that one side was good and the other was bad has brought you to the inevitable next step on this road of illusion, which is that all alternatives are bad. All dualistic struggle is fated to lead you into further traps, which are all products of illusion. When the road to the unified principle is chosen, soon what at first appeared to be one certain good and one obvious bad ceases to be so, and you inevitably encounter good and bad on both ends. And I think this is always good to, try to see, like to open yourself, to the deep like when you can't see the good on the other person's side, or what you're fighting against, like see if you can at least open a little bit more, and it's kind of like sometimes it's even just that little point of light in the darkness or whatever, but it's to really understand how those two are in relationship with each other. And when that road is pursued still further, there no longer is there any bad, but only good. And the road leads deep inside the real self into truth that goes way beyond their fearful little ego's interest. When this truth is sought deep inside the self, one approaches the unified state of consciousness. Our example is a banal one and can be translated into many everyday issues, big or small. It can take shape as a small squabble between mates or as a conflict between countries at war. It exists in all difficulties humanity encounters individually and collectively. As long as you find yourself in this illusory dualistic conflict, you will experience hopelessness, for there is no way out on the dualistic plane of thinking. So again, the only way out is not to figure out which, it's to go beyond, it's to transcend. So as long as your very existence is identified with the ego self and therefore with the dualistic approach to life, you cannot help but despair, no matter how much this despair is covered up or momentarily alleviated by occasional success with the desirable alternatives of the two opposites. The helplessness and hopelessness, the wasted energy of the dualistic struggle, rob you of your birthright. You can find your birthright only on the plane of unification. Since everything you learn from your education and environment is geared to dualistic standards, it is not surprising that you are totally attached and adapted to this state of consciousness. And even when you learn about this other possibility, you are frightened of it. You cannot believe it and you cling to what you know. This creates a vicious circle in the dualistic rules and precepts which condition you to this way of life. And they are themselves a result of your fear of giving up the egotistical state that seems alone to guarantee life. It appears that giving up this ego state means annihilation of your individuality, which, of course, is utterly erroneous. So, before we discuss in greater detail why you cling to the painful dualistic state, despite the immediate accessibility of the unified plane of consciousness, I would like to say more about how to realize unification within yourself. So this is partly, our question, like all of this makes sense, but then how do we do it, right? And it's, again, it's a journey, it's a practice, it's a process, but I like it when he gives us some hints and clues here. So he says the real self, the divine principle, the infinite intelligence, or whatever you wish to call that deep inner center existing in every human being, contains all wisdom and truth you can possibly envisage. The truth is so far-reaching and so directly accessible that no further conflict exists when this truth is allowed to take effect. And it's kind of one of the ways that immediately that you found, sort of the unified plane, right? Is it's like it immediately dissolves the conflict. The ifs and the buts of the dualistic state cease to exist. The knowledge of this inborn intelligence far surpasses the ego intelligence. It is completely objective. It disregards the small, vain self-interest. And this is one of the reasons you fear and avoid contact with it. The truth that flows out of it equalizes the self with others. Far from being the annihilation that the ego fears, the truth opens up the storehouse of vibrant life force and energy that you usually use to only a minor degree, and which you misuse in directing your attention and hopes to the dualistic plane with its tightly held opinions, false ideas, vanity, pride, self-will, and fear. When this life center activates you, you begin your limitless unfoldment, a process whose accomplishments become possible precisely because the little ego no longer wants to misuse them in order to find life as it did on the dualistic plane. The unified real self can always be contacted. So let's take this in for a minute, right? Because this is, usually it's a kind of an opening and a shift in consciousness, and part of the transition that happens. Like oftentimes in the beginning, you don't know that you have this, center inside of you. And even when you accept it and maybe believe it, or, it makes sense to you that everybody does, you don't have your own real direct contact with it, right? And we often don't recognize it when we do, when sometimes it does break through. So, a part of the journey is, to begin to realize and recognize, what this is. And oftentimes, even though it doesn't coddle the ego, right? It has great compassion for everything inside of us, right? And great understanding for why it's there, and how we came about it, honestly, and why we're here now in this place where we can actually take on its healing and its transformation. So the higher self guides us and helps us in this human life task that we have. And so it's really this beautiful relationship. And again, we're coming into the fall, which is Libra, which is all about relationship, right? And balance. So like this is, what we're seeking, to open this relationship with our own inner living center more and more. And so he says, like, let's return. He says the unified self can always be contacted. So let's again return to our example in order to see how. The hardest act to perform, which in reality is the easiest act possible, is to ask, what is the truth of the matter? So when you find yourself, in a positionality with a strong opinion, with a strong belief, with a need to convince, somebody that doesn't want to be convinced, in an argument over that, it's like, or even inside of yourself, where you're beating on yourself, you're judging yourself, you're, hating yourself, you're frustrated with yourself, you can assume that, yes, you must have done something horrible because of the way that you're treating yourself. But you can also like ask, well, did I really? What's the truth? What did I do? Why am I beating on myself? What's real here? What's the truth inside? And so when we dare to ask that question, and we're more intent on the truth than on proving who's right and who's wrong, then we contact the divine principle of transcendent unified truth. And these principles, in one way we think in rational consciousness that they're just conceptual principles, right? But I think in a lot of shamanic and also spiritist kind of contexts, these divine principles are beings, our energies, our consciousnesses, right? So he's saying that we contact this divine being of transcendent unified truth. And that aspect of ourself that is in touch with that. And if the desire to be in truth is genuine, the inspiration must come forth. No matter how strongly circumstances seem to point in one direction, you must be willing to relinquish and to question whether what you see is all there is to the issue. This generous act of integrity opens the way to the real self. So can you feel that? Can you take that in? Like it's this generous act of integrity that, is again seeking this truth and willing to, at least let go right now of the question of, right or wrong. So, I want to know what's real rather than I want to win. It's more important for me to know the truth than to win. And that's a very beautiful, act again of, self-sacrifice, of, this deep integrity. So it will be easier to follow through when you consider that it is not necessarily a question of either or. That there may be, in fact, to me, there always are aspects of right and wrong on both sides. Now, in this case, he's saying in the other person's view, sometimes it's internal and between the different parts of you, right? So, but there's aspects of right in the other person's view and wrong in yours, and aspects that so far you have not seen because your attention was not directed to this. But then there's also, you want to claim the aspects of truth in your side, right? But see where, there are aspects of falseness, and see in the other person the aspects of truth, and see where they're off. And oftentimes you'll see in the argument, it comes down to the defense, and where, people are missing the truth because they're in the defense, and the defense is coming from a place that's in fear or not truth in some way or another, that derails again, like whenever we go into this level of conflict, we're just creating a lot of backwash and conflictual energies, and stirring everything up, which is not a bad thing. It actually, stirs up and comes to the light, right? So it's like it's better to stir it up than to suppress it and hide it. But when we can stir it up and become conscious, awaken this presence, this higher self, this, way of, approaching, from the objective presence in consciousness, whatever's going on inside of us, and seeking that level of truth, then we often get very much insight, very much clarity in everything that's going on. So this approach to a problem immediately opens the way to rise to the unified plane of existence and to be moved by the real self. So, and then when, this is where it gets active, right? And then it immediately releases an energy that is distinctively felt when the act is done with a deep and sincere commitment. And it brings release from tension. And often in a conflictual relationship, it's like it resolves or, appeases or shifts the dynamic in a way that it can move forward. So what you then find out is always totally different, both from what you had hoped for and feared on the dualistic plane. You find that you are not as right and innocent as you thought, nor as wrong as you feared, and neither is your opponent. You soon discover aspects of the matter you never saw before, although they were not necessarily concealed. You understand exactly how the quarrel came into existence in the first place, what led to it, what its history was long before its actual manifestation. With such discoveries, you gain insight into the very nature of your relationship. You learn about yourself and the other, and you increase your understanding of the laws of communication. And the more vision you gain, the freer, stronger, and more secure you feel. And this vision not only eliminates this particular conflict and shows the right way to straighten it out, but it also reveals important aspects of your general difficulties and makes their elimination easier through this understanding. The vibrant peace that comes from this extended understanding is of lasting value. It affects your self-realization and your daily life. What I describe as a typical example of unified intuitive understanding, of knowing the truth. And after the initial apparent need for courage and the momentary resistance to seeing a wider truth than the egotistical one, your path becomes so much easier than the struggle that ensued on the either-or plane of the dualistic life. So any comments? Let me pause here for a minute. So before you can bring yourself to the unified way of thinking and being, the tension will mount. For as long as you remain on the dualistic plane, you struggle against unification because you falsely believe that the moment you admit and see where you are wrong and the other is right, you submit and enslave yourself. This is part of what you were speaking to, Jacob. And you become nothing, worthless, pitiful, and from there it is only a step to annihilation in your fantasy life. Hence you feel that leaving your dualistic plane is the greatest danger, and the tension will mount as your conflicts escalate. But the moment you are willing to be in truth, the moment you are eager and prepared not merely to see your way, your little truth, not to give in to the other's little truth in fear of the consequence if you do not, but when you wish to possess the larger, more encompassing truth, which transcends both of your little truths, a specific tension will be removed in your psyche, and the way toward the manifestation of the real self will have been prepared. So I think this is like a really good key here too, if we can catch it, right? So to recognize, like, if we're in a dualistic conflict within ourselves or with somebody else, right? It's like that in itself is telling us that there is a third way, like we're in this, either or, duality. And like, it's like the mind can't resolve it at that level of the problem, right? We have to jump to another level. So it's kind of like whenever you feel yourself in conflict, that you can know, okay, this conflict is a fundamental illusion. There's some truth that I'm missing here that will automatically unify this situation, this conflict, right? And so I want to open myself, like to like find this way forward that actually is the answer out of the split. And when we can, sort of open to this possibility, like, oh, it's not a my way or their way, but the fact that we're in this fight means that there is a third way that is really the way that the universe is trying to get us to find. And our job is to discover that third way, and that's the adventure, and that's the call to the higher level of possibility. So, just realizing, that the duality implies, another answer that we're seeking. And if we can, remember that and look beyond the particular conflict, that can lead us to this other level. I think I read that part. So let me recapitulate here. The two most significant obstructions to the real self are ignorance of its existence and the possibility of connecting with it. So if we don't know it's there or that we can connect with it, then it's hard to, utilize it. And then this tight, cramped psychic state with tight, cramped soul movements. And these two factors make contact impossible with the real self, and therefore with the unified state of existence. So as long as you're on a dualistic plane, you must be in a constant soul cramp. So I don't know if that makes sense to you, or if you can feel your own version of that soul cramp, in different levels. And, there's kind of like this character structure that's inside of us, that's frozen in us, right? That kind of is our overall mood and position about things, that, is kind of what they call the default network, I think, in our brains, that we're familiar, this familiar sense of self, our old complaints, our old stories, all part of this. And so to some degree, when I go in my body, unless I'm really, consciously connected in the light, I'm in this lower realm where things are tighter and cramped and, heavier and, more agitating and all of that. So you may remember how often I discuss the importance of observing your soul movements. And so when you fight against one dualistic aspect and press for the other, observe your soul movements. Specifically, you may lean on the apparent justification of the position you press for. You may say, am I not perfectly justified in combating this wrong in the world? On the dualistic plane, this may indeed be so, but with this limited outlook, you ignore that this very wrong exists only because of your dualistic approach to the problem and your prevalent ignorance that there is another approach. The resulting tension blurs the view that other aspects exist, which both unify what you deem right and what you deem wrong, regardless of what the wrong actually is. So the simple act of wanting the truth requires several conditions, the most important being the willingness to relinquish what one holds on to, whether this be a belief, a fear, or a cherished way of being. So tune in and let that sink in a little. So the simple act of wanting the truth requires a willingness to relinquish what we hold on to. And when I say relinquish, I merely mean questioning it, right? Being willing to see that there is something else beyond this outlook. This brings us back to why you are terrified to relinquish the ego state, hence the dualistic, painful way of life. Why do you resist so much committing yourself to this deep inner center, which unifies all good and is instantly accessible? It is, however, beyond the personal little considerations of the ego. The dualistic plane is the plane of the ego. The unified plane is the world of the divine center. And so it's kind of like in this world now, I think we're coming to a place where we have to kind of decide. I think the time of the ego is limited, right? And we're all being encouraged to, transcend that place. So the unified plane is the world of the divine center and the larger self. And the ego finds its whole existence on the plane in which it is at home. So to relinquish this plane means to give up the claims of the little ego. This does not mean annihilation, but to the ego, it seems to mean just this. Actually, the ego is a particle, an isolated aspect of the master intelligence, the real inner self. It is not different from it. There is simply less of the real self in it. So our totality is just much more capacity and greater, wisdom and, awareness than our ego. So since it is separate and limited, the ego, it's less reliable and than what it stems from. But this does not mean that the ego has to be annihilated. In fact, the ego will eventually integrate with the real self so that there is only one self, which will be fuller, better equipped, and wiser. It will have more and better assets than you can imagine. But the separated ego thinks this development means annihilation. In its ignorant, limited way, the ego exists only as a separated being. Hence, it pursues further separateness. Since the limited consciousness ignores the existence of the real self, even if it is accepted as a theory, its living reality will be doubted as long as personal misconceptions are not eliminated. It fears letting go and relaxing its tight hold, the very soul movement that leads to the real self. So this is one of the ways that we can work with it as well, right? It's just to notice where we're holding on, where we're resistant, where we're gripping, where there's a tight soul movement, right? And again, so much of the path is about helping ourselves to relax, right? Questioning, well, do I need to be tight right now? Probably not in this moment, right? So we can be aware where we're holding and just gently encourage and invite that holding to let go. And it may unconsciously come back because sometimes it's a habit or something like that. But each time we get aware of it, and relax and center and ground ourselves, then we're also making contact with this aspect. And the real self cannot manifest as long as personal problems are not straightened out. Well, I would say sometimes it can help us straighten out those personal problems. But the process of doing this and the first inklings of self-realization often overlap, and one furthers the other. Many of my friends can use these words to take a new approach to their problems, although there's nothing new in my words as such. However, this way of looking at your basic human struggle may help you considerably. As long as you are totally identified with your ego, you will continue to cultivate more separation, and self-idealization must be the consequence. Self-glorification and idealization seems, from this point of view, the apparent solution and guarantee to assuage your existential fears. The ego thinks, if everyone around me considers me special, right, better than others, smart, beautiful, talented, happy, unhappy, or even bad, or whatever specialty you have chosen for your idealized self-glorification, then I will receive the necessary approval, love, admiration, and agreement that I need in order to live. This argument means that somewhere deep down you believe that you can exist only through being noticed, affirmed, and confirmed by others. In other words, to be right, right? And you feel that if you go by unnoticed, you cease to live. This may sound exaggerated, but it is not. And it explains why your idealized self-image is destructive. You feel more confident when you make yourself noticed than when you make positive efforts. So your salvation seems to lie in others who would acknowledge your existence only if, again, we're the right ones, it's like it's interesting how those two get connected, right? So the death, the annihilation is that we're not seen, we're not affirmed, we're not confirmed. And if we can, go back to the pain of that in childhood, which was when there was a real pain there, right? We really needed that and it wasn't there. And we can just simply let the present day pain of that, roll back and allow ourselves to hold ourselves in the child's pain of not being seen, of not being acknowledged, of not being, because there was a time when we needed that from outside of ourselves. We needed people to look into our eyes and, shine back at us our value, our worth, our, that we're loved and seen. And when we didn't get that, there was a hole. And so now we're trying to still get it from people outside of us, but that's not where it comes from now. It's kind of like imprinting and duckling. So, the time has passed, and who can give it to you now is not outside of you, but is your own inner connection with this higher self, with this unitive inner depth of your own being. And for that one to see you, right, and know you, and for you to know and see yourself in that way, will, let you, it's always better when other people also see and know you, but if they don't, it's not like a death. It's not the end of the world, right? Because you're grounded and you're also willing to look and see, like, well, what like they've got a side too, or there's something going on here in this, thing that is calling for something broader, something more unifying. So, let me take on this puzzle on the blackboard that's my assignment in this moment and try to, do the math somehow and make it turn out differently than the same old arguments and splits and stuff like that. Your existence seems to be guaranteed when you are totally loved, accepted, and served by others, and you hope to attain this by triumphing over them. You can now see that you are governed by a succession of wrong conclusions, which are all completely different in reality. You will further come to see, not only as theory, but as reality, that your life does not depend on others' affirmations of your existence, and that you do not need to be special and separate from others, and that this very claim traps you in loneliness and confusion. that others will give you love and acceptance only when you do not wish to be better than they are, or special, or different from them. Again, in the right, wrong, it's kind of like, I'm better than you, I'm more right, it's like, so that it's like puts somebody else in a one down position. And what we need to relate is equality. So if we have to be one up or one down, we cannot be in relationship. There's no equality there. So part of that journey is then, okay, so even though I believe in my side of it, how can I create equality here? Which means let me listen and take in and, comprehend the complementary, other side of things, or the truth in what they're saying, or whatever.
Darlene,
Uh-huh.
so as we're going through this lecture, some things are coming up or occurring to me. One of them is that somewhere along the line, the guide has said that God is truth. What is God? God is truth. We're talking about truth in this lecture. Truth seems to be like the beam to enlightenment, to unification. But it also occurs to me that even if we knew the truth about everything, so to speak, how the cosmos works, and all of that, we still wouldn't be free, because we wouldn't know the truth about ourselves. And that's really is where the door, the open door lies. It's like knowing the truth about yourself. It's like you can't say, okay, if I know the truth, I'll be enlightened. Tell me the truth and I'll be enlightened.
Yeah. And
It doesn't
even
work
about
that way.
yourself,
Right.
yeah, because it's not a static truth. It's an
Right.
ongoing truth. It's a presence in every moment kind of truth, right? And so it's like I think it is in some ways reflected in the outer or the ongoing universe, but it also exactly, it's like that truth is revealing itself through us moment by moment, right? And then, we're seeing the temporary truth of our emotional reaction perhaps, and yet there's a deeper truth beyond that it points to or opens us to, right? So that we continue to just be present and seeking this like where we are in conflict or duality, like this larger principle that seems to collapse that duality.
Yes.
Did you want, was there more? I'm sorry, I kind of jumped in on you.
No, I just was wondering if maybe there was a lecture. It's like, okay, so what's the truth? How do you find the truth? Because
Well, I think
I think we already know the answer to that, of course, but it's your self-exploration, the exploration of yourself that leads you to the truth, but it's not always so evident. And there's not always someone or something that can show you what your truth is. I mean, that's what apparently there's what pathwork training is all about. They're supposed to, we're train enough people that so they can point you to your truth, but then you still have to see it and admit it to yourself.
right. I mean, and nobody can, it's like it's an inner journey for each one of us. And, we can leave, like it's all fingers pointing to the moon, but you have to have it within, your own experience. And it is like, I mean, the guide to me in every one of these lectures, points out universal truths, right? And one of them in this lecture is, like we all have this consciousness, this unitive, superior consciousness available to us in ways that we don't even know about at this point, right? And part of, the truth is that we're learning how to access that, and how to awaken that inside of us, so that, that I believe is kind of the first step to take us into even more truth, because to me that's like the observer, the witness, and then that part that simply observes and witnesses and notices what's alive in us, is what is giving us the self-knowledge of who we are, of what's inside of us, and what's a temporary truth, and what's a universal truth, and we may have a reaction, but we begin to understand, that that's, an important temporary truth, but it's not ultimate truth, right? And it's just a journey inside where we can use the maps that the lectures give us, but it is that we have to discover what he's describing within, and then you kind of know it and you recognize it, and it becomes, grounded and real and accessible to use as well, right? So like,
Yeah.
going on that trip, I felt like, like all of the practice that I had, or the experiences kind of converged and, opened a possibility for me to practice a unitive experience and have the fullness of that experience in a way that I hadn't been capable of before. So we sort of develop our capacity to hold and expand into these unitive states. And then as we do that more and more, we realize, oh, that's what we're looking for, what and then it's kind of like, well, just noticing whenever we're not, and how we fall out of that and get back into the duality, and then notice, well, what's my little ego afraid of, what's the truth about the fear? Is the fear real? Is it something that I need to feel, that there's some real danger there? And usually we, recognize no, but then we still can't just say, well, stop feeling it, or whatever. So then we have to also be with the temporary truth of the fear as it experiences in our body, right? Without intensifying it by believing that there's something really to be afraid of. So now we're just saying, okay, this is what fear feels like. It's not really, necessarily, anything that's here right now, but it's in me. And so just feel the sensation of the fear and don't have fear of the fear, then I can, open to that movement in that kind of
Well,
you
on your journey, on your trip, did you feel like you had a big letting go of your self-will?
yeah. I mean, it was necessary, important for me to do that, just for my own sanity, um and also, was an opportunity for that in the circumstances and the way it was set up, and then there was some grace, that helped hold me in that. But yeah, and every time I would watch myself get a little hooked in that self-will, it's like I would wake up to it and recognize it and make a different choice and shift back into unitive state. And then the flow would continue, the magic would continue. It's like every time I did that, the way that the universe would respond, was pretty clear confirmation, right? That there's a different experience, and also a different way that the universe configures around our energies when we're in that more surrendered state, less self-will.
I think that's what the guy was talking about a few paragraphs back, maybe, when he said, when you step into a state of willingness to know the truth or to ask for the truth, you are essentially giving up your self-will.
Right.
And
it doesn't have to be some kind of great ultimate truth. I mean, in those cases, it was like, well, what is the truth of what is going to happen next?
yeah.
Right? Because, and so the truth arises, right? Out of that open field, and and sometimes it was, well, what happened next is, I lost my power steering fluid and I was on hairpin turns, right? So that was like a little exciting. but then, what happened next out of that, was this kind of very interesting experience with a Santa Cruz mechanic who was a yoga artist, painter, I don't know,
Great.
break dancer, yeah.
Yeah.
And so we had like this, sort of live entertainment as this guy was, I guess it was like a performing artist, mechanic in Santa Cruz. and and he fixed me, and it was a beautiful, grace-filled, enjoyable experience, instead of, upset, frustrated, all of that. So anyway, yeah, it just, when we let go of the self-will, I think that's when the universe can show up with its greater wisdom and its potential miracles that it has to offer. And then we're there, to receive it, which is really cool. Like if I had been all contracted in a negative dualistic state, I wouldn't have enjoyed as much of what I enjoyed, right? I wouldn't have been present for it, to just take it in and let magic unfurl. So, and then, just trying to remember and continue to do that, on a daily basis. So he's going on here still around, like this belief in that the ego has, that we have to be somehow separate. So let's see. So when you look at your problems in as objective and detached a way as you can muster, expressing the wider outlook of the real self as you turn your best intent and will to the matter that disturbs you with a genuine wish for impartiality, you will first notice a shrinking back from such a desire in more or less overt or subtle way of covering up your desire for flight, excuse me. Catch yourself in this act and courageously forge on, questioning yourself further and deeper. And you will then come to see that finally the outer difficulty is a symbolic representation of your inner quarrel, where you fight for life against death, for existence against annihilation. So wherever we feel like we're trapped in that dualistic craziness, it's like try to distill it into this place where we can see, the belief that, we're fighting for life against death. And then ask, is that true? Right? Like bring the image to the conscious surface, and then try to, question the belief, right? So you will see that what you evidently believe is required from others in order for you to exist. So this is also, what we see, what we need from others in order for us to exist. And when you have arrived at this level of your being, you will be able to question your precepts that lay the foundation for this. So again, the truth, and this is the first step to make possible the transition from dualistic error to unified truth. You will further notice that relinquishing ideals and convictions also feels like annihilation. For being wrong means dying, and being right means living. In the moment you go through this movement of opening up and have the courage to want the truth, a more complete truth than you can see at the moment in whatever issue, you will come to a new peace and a new intuitive knowledge about the way things are. Something in your hardened psychic substance will have loosened up and will further prepare the way for total self-realization. So not only is this, resolving a dualistic conflict, but it's preparing you for total self-realization. So each time you loosen up the climate in your psyche, it will be more auspicious for the final total awakening to your inner center, which contains all life, all truth, all the unified goodness of creation. Every step in this direction abandons another misconception, and each misconception represents another burden. The giving up of what first seemed like protection from annihilation will now be disclosed as what it really is: burden, suffering, imprisonment. And you then comprehend the preposterous fact that you are actually opposed to leaving the dualistic life with all its hardship and hopelessness. Perhaps you can now understand some of this, and it will help you in your personal path. When you apply this to your everyday life, you will see that the abstract sounding words I use here are not something far away, but accessible for every one of you. You will see that these words are practical and concrete if you are willing to see yourself in relationship to life in a wider truth than you are as yet willing even to contemplate. On the dualistic plane, you must have everything your way. So this is the self-will that you're referring to, Frank. You must win over life, over others, over circumstances. You must prove yourself to be stronger than all other forces in your life that may oppose you. Opposing you means that you lose, and losing in the last analysis means annihilation. That is what you are frightened of and why you are so intense in this struggle. That is why you always feel as though something much larger were at stake than the actual issue. So you're going to feel that way, right? You know, it's going to feel like death, but the question is it really, right? This is the shaman's death. And so having the courage to face and feel the illusory death will set you free. So this is why we deny the intensity of the emotions, knowing that what takes place on the conscious level is not commensurate with our real reactions. So oftentimes we're just rejecting, you know, all of these feelings that are coming in us and trying to squelch them or push them away, and that doesn't work either. So, you know, in this way, we really need to take them on and understand their truth, but it's a temporary truth. It's a reality of a dualistic, you know, experience. And then we want to go for the larger truth, the unitive truth. So each new and so I'm going to skip a little bit of this. So when we're in this dependency, you know, we need life to move always according to our needs. And when it doesn't, there's a lot of fear and anxiety and agitation and, you know, and so, you know, that was the other thing that I noticed. I used to not travel very well, you know, because I would be anxious about having everything I needed. And there was some of that in this trip, you know, and having my vehicle with me with everything I needed helped some too. But I was also aware that there were more often than not times when I was aware that I didn't have something right with me, and I let it go. You know, I didn't get all like hung up around that and anxious over it and like, you know, worried about, you know, I might have been a little cooler than my body temperature usually liked, but I didn't feel like I had to grab a blanket right away, that kind of thing. So there was, you know, some, you know, ways of just being in states of need, you know, and realizing it was okay, right? You know, that it wasn't the end of the world. And so he's talking about, you know, when we become dependent, you know, then we become resentful of whatever is in the way of prohibiting the gratification that we need. And that was probably the one place where I still noticed it. You know, it's like my interaction still with help people in corporate, you know, like I was trying to call my bank and, you know, I was like yelling at the phone system, you know, it wasn't even a human being because it just wasn't meeting my need. I couldn't get it to tell me where to go. And so, you know, where we have these, you know, it's like it feels very deep. And in some ways I feel like, you know, there's something that has breached a kind of contract between the systems that we're used to using and we're dependent on, and the support and the ability of the systems to, you know, kind of take care of us. And so there's kind of PTSD, I think, in a lot of this, you know, kind of new computer reliant world that we're in, and we don't know how it works and we don't know always how to fix it and stuff. So again, needs that are unmet, right? And how difficult those become. And so we can become resentful of life, which seemingly does not let us have what we want or let us be. And I can remember doing that sometimes. I had a flat tire this week driving down, and one of the times I would have felt like God was picking on me in that situation, right? So I'm growing. I didn't go there this time. It didn't even, it's not that I'm controlling it, or blocking it. It's just these things are no longer coming up in the same way that they used to. So the message coming from the real self says, your birthright is perfect happiness, freedom, and mastery over life. But then when we fight for this birthright according to dualistic principles, we actually remove ourselves further and further from the self-realization in which we could truly have that mastery, freedom, and total fulfillment. And we seek all of this with false means. These are as varied as each individual's character. So if you restudy them in the light of this lecture, you will understand on a deeper level what it is all about, and you will see how you personally try to set up the false fight, leading into more confusion and pain. The three basic pseudo-solutions are simply means for conquering life on the dualistic plane to guarantee our existence. So the three basic pseudo-solutions, right, are the, submission, withdrawal, and aggression. And so, all of those are just trying to, make life comply on this dualistic plane. The futile struggle hardens the psychic material, and the more brittle it becomes, the less we're able to contact the center of our inner being, where everything we possibly need is found. And the only way that you can enter the unitive state where you can truly achieve mastery is by letting go of the false need to win, to be separate, to be special, to be right, to have it your way. Discover the good in all situations, whether you deem them good or bad, right or wrong. Needless to say, this does not mean resignation, nor does it mean fearful giving in or weakness. It means going with the stream of life and coping with what is as yet beyond your immediate control, whether or not it is according to your liking. It means accepting where you are and why and what life is for you at this moment. It means being in harmony with your own inner rhythm. This procedure will open the channel to your God self so that finally total self-realization takes place. All your expressions in life will be motivated and lived through by the divine principle operating in you and expressing itself through your individuality, integrating your ego facilities with its universal self. Such integration enhances your individuality. It does not diminish it. It enhances every one of your pleasures. It takes nothing away from you whatever. May every one of you comprehend that the truth is in you. Everything you need is in you. May you find that you actually do not have to struggle as you constantly do. All you have to do is recognize the truth wherever you stand now. All you have to do at this time is acknowledge that there may be more in you than you see. Call upon this inner center and allow yourself to be open to its intuitive messages to you. May you find this possible exactly where you need it most at this particular moment. Your gauge is always what feels most uncomfortable. Where are you most tempted to look away? So be blessed. Continue on your wonderful path, which will bring you to the realization that you already have what you need and are where you need to be. You merely look away because you are geared in the opposite direction. Be in peace and be in God. So any final comments or questions? A deep lecture, it's like, but I think like a good one to kind of imagine, to expand our imagination into and see if we can stretch a little, apply a little, and see what happens.
I just
Hey,
wanted
Andy.
to say thank you. I just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah.
That's all. It's beautiful, and I'm trying to do those things myself actually without this lecture. And now I'm thinking like, yeah, trying to live in the moment, I guess, more than ever. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the.
Yeah,
It's
good.
nice to listen. Yeah. Thank you.
Glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, it looks like we lost a few people along the way, but
I mean, it's late. It's been 2
yeah,
hours.
it is. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it was a
usually
long
about 2
lecture.
hours long. So yeah, well, the
Thank
lectures
you,
take about,
Darlene.
yeah. Yeah, good night. Good night, Dominique. Hope you had a good one. We'll
Yes.
see
night.
you on
Okay.
Tuesday, next Tuesday then, right?
Good night.
Yes.
Okay, great. Take care. Bye-bye.